The date was December 1943, and the air war over Europe had become a calculated slaughter. High above the frozen German countryside, American B-17 flying fortresses droned in their tight combat boxes, each one a lumbering giant packed with 10 young men and enough bombs to level a factory. They flew in daylight, a strategy that British commanders thought was suicidal, and for good reason. The Luftwaffe owned the skies beyond the range of Allied fighters, and they knew it. German pilots would wait, circling like sharks beyond the reach of the American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that could only escort the bombers partway to their targets. Then, when the escort fighters turned back, their fuel tanks running dry, the slaughter would begin. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s would tear into the bomber formations with savage efficiency, ripping through aluminum and flesh with 20mm cannon fire. Entire squadrons were being erased from the sky. On some missions, the loss rate exceeded 20%. The men flying those missions knew the statistics, knew that their chances of surviving a full tour of 25 missions were brutally slim, but they climbed into their aircraft anyway because someone had to break the Nazi war machine, and the only way to do that was to destroy the factories, the refineries, the infrastructure that kept it running. But the cost was becoming unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was bleeding to death, and the German pilots knew it. They had every reason to be confident, even cocky. Their fighters were excellent, their pilots experienced, and the strategic equation was simple. If the Americans couldn't protect their bombers deep into German territory, they couldn't win the air war. And if they couldn't win the air war, the invasion of Europe would fail before it even began. The Luftwaffe had the advantage, and they were determined to keep it. That confidence, that sense of inevitable victory, would be their undoing, because across the Atlantic, something new was being born. The story of that something new began, not with a stroke of genius, but with a failure and an act of desperation. In early 1940, the British Purchasing Commission arrived in the United States with a shopping list and a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. France was about to fall, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, and the Royal Air Force desperately needed more fighters. They approached North American Aviation, a company known for building trainers and light bombers, but not fighters. The British wanted them to build P-40 Warhawks under license, a proven design from Curtiss-Wright. But North American's chief designer, a brilliant and stubborn engineer named Edgar Schmude, had a different idea. He told the British that he could design a better fighter from scratch, and he could do it in 120 days. It was an audacious claim, almost absurd. Designing a combat aircraft normally took years, not months, but Schmude had been studying every fighter design in existence, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, and he believed he knew how to build the perfect Predator. The British, desperate and willing to gamble, gave him the contract. Schmude and his team worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that men were dying in the skies over Britain while they bent over their drafting tables. They made radical choices. Instead of the usual radial engine, they designed the airframe around the new Allison V1710 inline engine, which gave the aircraft a sleek, low-drag profile. They used a laminar flow wing, a cutting-edge aerodynamic design that reduced drag even further. They positioned the radiator under the fuselage in a way that actually generated thrust from the cooling air, a brilliant trick that turned a liability into an advantage. The result was an aircraft that looked fast, even sitting still, with lines as clean as a blade. It had the stance of a predator, nose down, tail up, ready to pounce. When the first prototype rolled out, it was christened the NA-73X, but it would soon carry a name that would become legend, the Mustang. The first test flights in late 1940 confirmed what Schmude had suspected. The Mustang was fast, incredibly fast, and it handled like a dream. But there was a problem, a critical flaw that threatened to kill the entire program. The Allison engine, while powerful at low altitude, lost performance dramatically above 15,000 feet. In the high-altitude war over Europe, where bombers flew at 25, feet or higher, and fighters climbed even beyond that. The early Mustangs were handicapped. They were beautiful. They were fast down low. But up high where it mattered, they couldn't compete with the Bf-109s and FW-190s. The British used the early Mustangs for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, roles where they excelled, but the aircraft couldn't fulfill its destiny as a long-range escort fighter. The Americans, initially skeptical of the design, relegated their early Mustangs to training and tactical roles. It seemed like the Mustang, for all its promise, would be remembered as a missed opportunity, a fighter that could have been great, but fell short where it counted most. Then, in 1942, an RAF test pilot named Ronnie Harker flew a Mustang and immediately recognized its potential. But he also saw the problem. After his flight, he wrote a report suggesting something radical. What if they replaced the Allison engine with the Rolls-Royce Merlin? The same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire? The Merlin was a supercharged masterpiece that maintained its power at high altitude. It was exactly what the Mustang needed. The idea made its way to Rolls-Royce and then to North American aviation. Engineers on both sides of the Atlantic began working on the marriage of British power and American aerodynamics. The result was the P-51B, and later, the refined P-51D, aircraft that would change the course of the war. When the Merlin-powered Mustang first took to the sky, test pilots knew immediately that something extraordinary had been created. The performance was staggering. The P-51D could reach speeds of over 440 miles per hour, faster than almost any fighter in the sky. It could climb to 40,000 feet and still fight effectively. But the most revolutionary characteristic was its range. With external drop tanks, the P-51 could fly over 600 miles, which meant it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do. The strategic implications were immense and immediate. For the first time, American bombers would have protection for their entire mission, all the way to the target and all the way home. The Luftwaffe's hunting ground, that deadly gap where German fighters had operated with impunity, was about to be closed. But the Mustang wasn't just about range and speed. It was about combat effectiveness. It carried 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, a devastating concentration of firepower. The aircraft was remarkably agile, able to outturn most German fighters, and its visibility from the cockpit, especially in the later bubble canopy D model, was excellent. Pilots could see threats coming from almost any angle. The combination of speed, range, maneuverability, and firepower made the P-51 the most complete fighter aircraft of the war. But none of that mattered if it couldn't be produced in numbers and if pilots couldn't be trained to fly it effectively. By early 1944, P-51 Mustangs were rolling off assembly lines in massive numbers. American industrial capacity, that sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had warned Japan about, was now fully awake and producing weapons at a pace that the Axis powers simply could not match. Thousands of young American pilots, many barely out of their teens, were being trained to fly the Mustang. They learned its systems, its strengths, and its few weaknesses. They practiced formation flying, gunnery, and the brutal geometry of high-speed combat. And then they were shipped across the Atlantic to England, to bases in East Anglia, where they joined fighter groups with names that would become legendary: the 4th, the 357th, the 352nd. These young men, many on their first trip away from home, were about to face the most experienced and deadly fighter pilots in the world, and they were about to do it in an aircraft that would give them a fighting chance not just to survive, but to dominate. The first large-scale Mustang escort missions began in December 1943, and the German pilots noticed immediately that something had changed. The Americans had always had fighters escorting their bombers, but those fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, had always turned back at a certain point, their fuel exhausted. The Luftwaffe had learned to recognize that turning point, that invisible line in the sky where the hunters became the hunted. But now, when the German pilots climbed to intercept the bomber formations deep over their own territory, expecting to find them undefended, They found sleek, silver aircraft with checkered noses and distinctive invasion stripes waiting for them. The Mustangs had arrived, and they weren't turning back. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was immediate and profound. For years, they had owned the deep skies over Germany. Now, suddenly, they were being challenged in their own airspace, and not just challenged, but systematically hunted. The tactical doctrine of the Mustang groups was aggressive to the point of recklessness. Unlike earlier escort tactics, which kept fighters tightly bound to the bomber formations, Mustang pilots were given freedom to pursue and destroy German fighters wherever they found them. The standing order was simple: engage and destroy the enemy. If a formation of Bf-109s was spotted climbing to attack altitude, a flight of Mustangs would dive on them before they could reach the bombers. If German fighters tried to escape, the Mustangs, with their superior speed and range, would chase them, sometimes all the way back to their own airfields. The hunted had become the hunters, and the Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to dictating the terms of engagement, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival in every encounter. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the highest-scoring Mustang aces, with 26, 83 confirmed kills. His technique was clinical and brutal. He would position his flight above and behind enemy formations, use the Mustang's speed to dive on them, and then, using the aircraft's superior acceleration, either destroy his target in the first pass or pursue it relentlessly until it was smoking wreckage falling toward the earth. On one mission, Preddy shot down 6 German fighters in a single day, a feat that demonstrated not just his skill but the overwhelming capability of the aircraft he flew. His Mustang, adorned with kill markings and named Cripes a Mighty Third, became a symbol of American air superiority. Other pilots developed their own techniques, exploiting every advantage the Mustang offered. The aircraft could outdive almost anything, which meant that in a fight, a Mustang pilot could always choose to break off and escape if things went wrong. But more often, they didn't need to escape. The Mustang could turn with a Bf-109, out-accelerate an FW-190 in level flight, and out-climb both at high altitude. The German response was desperate and telling. Luftwaffe commanders issued new tactical instructions to their pilots. Avoid combat with Mustangs if at all possible. Focus on the bombers. But avoiding combat wasn't an option when Mustangs were actively hunting them. German fighter units began suffering catastrophic losses. Experienced pilots, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, men who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts, were being shot down over their own country. The loss rate became unsustainable. By mid-1944, the average life expectancy of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot on the Western Front was measured in weeks, not months. The Germans tried everything. They developed new tactics, forming large fighter formations called Gefechtsverband, massive gaggles of 40 or 50 fighters that would attack bomber formations en masse, hoping that sheer numbers would overwhelm the escorts. Sometimes it worked, and bombers fell from the sky in flames, but the cost to the German fighter forces was horrific. Mustangs would tear into these formations, and the disciplined American pilots, working in coordinated pairs, would methodically destroy German fighters until the formation broke apart in panic. The Luftwaffe introduced the Focke-Wulf Ta-152, a high-altitude interceptor designed specifically to counter the Mustang. It was fast, well-armed, and capable at extreme altitudes, but it came too late and in too few numbers to make a difference. They deployed the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, an aircraft that was genuinely superior to the Mustang in speed. The Me-262 was a terrifying sight, a predator from the future, and it could slash through bomber formations almost untouchable. But the jets had weaknesses. They were vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Their engines were unreliable and fuel was scarce. Mustang pilots learned to patrol near known jet bases, waiting for the Me-262s to land, and then pounce on them when they were slow and defenseless. It was unglamorous work, but it was effective. The technological advantage of the jet was neutralized by superior tactics and the sheer numbers of Mustangs that filled the sky. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of the Mustang's dominance came during Big Week in February 1944, a coordinated series of massive daylight raids designed to destroy the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, struck targets across Germany. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense, launching over 1,000 sorties. The sky over Germany became a swirling, three-dimensional battlefield, the largest air battle in history. Contrails crisscrossed the frozen sky, tracers arced between aircraft, and burning planes, both German and American, fell like meteors. But when the week ended and the losses were tallied, the result was devastating for Germany. The Luftwaffe had lost over 350 fighters, and more critically, nearly 100 pilots killed. American losses were significant, but replaceable. German losses were not. The back of the Luftwaffe fighter force had been broken, and the P-51 Mustang had been the weapon that broke it. The pilots who flew the Mustang developed an almost mystical bond with the aircraft. They trusted it in a way that pilots rarely trust machines. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, another top ace, once said that the Mustang was the only fighter he ever flew that he felt could do anything he asked of it. If he needed speed, it gave him speed. If he needed to turn, it turned. If he needed to get home on one engine and a prayer, it would do that too. Stories of Mustangs bringing their pilots home despite catastrophic damage became legendary. Aircraft would return to base with wings shredded by cannon fire, tails half shot away, engines held together by sheer will, and still they flew. The ruggedness wasn't accidental. North American aviation had built the Mustang not just to fight, but to survive, and that philosophy saved countless lives. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Europe was effectively over. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, but it was a shadow of its former self, a scattered remnant hiding from overwhelming Allied air superiority. Mustangs roamed over Germany at will, strafing airfields, rail yards, and anything that moved. The missions became less about air combat and more about destruction of infrastructure, the final dismantling of the Nazi war machine. German pilots who did manage to get airborne often didn't even try to fight. They would jettison their external fuel tanks and dive for the ground, hoping to escape. Most didn't. The kill ratios tell the story with brutal clarity. For every Mustang lost in air combat, Luftwaffe fighters were being destroyed at a rate of 4 to 1, sometimes higher. The Germans had laughed at the idea of American air power, dismissed it as the product of a nation of factory workers and farmers who couldn't possibly match the skill and tradition of the Luftwaffe. They had been catastrophically wrong. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang extends far beyond the simple statistics of aircraft destroyed and missions flown. It represents a turning point in the nature of air warfare and a case study in how technological innovation, when combined with strategic vision and industrial capacity, can fundamentally alter the course of history. Before the Mustang, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany was failing. The losses were unsustainable, the effectiveness questionable, and there were serious discussions in Allied command about abandoning daylight bombing altogether, ceding the skies to the Luftwaffe, and accepting a longer, bloodier war. The Mustang changed that calculation completely. It didn't just protect bombers, it seized control of the airspace itself, transforming the European sky from a contested battleground into an American domain. The aircraft's impact on the ground war was equally profound, though less immediately visible. By achieving air superiority, the Mustang enabled the success of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they did so under skies that were almost completely clear of German aircraft. The Luftwaffe, decimated by months of attrition against Mustang-equipped fighter groups, could barely muster a response. Eisenhower himself acknowledged that without air superiority, the invasion would have been impossible, and air superiority over Europe was secured primarily by one aircraft, the P-51. In the months following D-Day, as Allied armies pushed across France and into Germany, Mustangs provided close air support, interdicted supply lines, and continued to hunt the remnants of the Luftwaffe. The pilots adapted to these new roles with the same effectiveness they had shown in high-altitude escort missions, demonstrating the versatility that made the Mustang such a complete weapon system. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Mustang was what it represented philosophically. It was proof that wars are not won by single factors, by individual heroism or superior racial characteristics, as Nazi ideology claimed, but by the integration of multiple elements: engineering excellence, industrial production, pilot training, tactical innovation, and strategic thinking. The Mustang was the product of an Anglo-American collaboration designed by an immigrant team in California, powered by a British engine, manufactured in multiple factories across the United States, and flown by pilots from every background and every state. It was the embodiment of democratic industrial power, and it crushed the forces of fascism not through mystical superiority, but through better design, better production, and better strategy. The German pilots who faced it learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. After the war, many captured Luftwaffe pilots were interviewed by Allied intelligence officers, asked to assess the various fighters they had faced. Their opinions on the Mustang were remarkably consistent and grudgingly respectful. They acknowledged that while individual German aircraft might have advantages in specific areas, the Bf-109 at low altitude, the FW-190 in a dive, the TA-152 at extreme height, none of them could match the overall capability of the Mustang. More importantly, they recognized that the Mustang represented something they couldn't counter: an enemy with unlimited resources, infinite replacement aircraft, and a pipeline of trained pilots that never ran dry. One German ace, when asked what it was like to face Mustangs day after day, said simply that it was like trying to hold back the ocean with your hands. You might win individual fights, survive individual missions, but the tide was inevitable, and eventually it would sweep you away. The Mustang continued to serve long after World War II ended. It saw combat in Korea, where it served primarily as a ground attack aircraft, its long range and heavy payload making it ideal for supporting troops and interdicting supply lines in a different kind of war. Many Mustangs were sold to Allied air forces around the world and saw service in dozens of smaller conflicts throughout the 1950s and beyond. Even today, hundreds of restored Mustangs still fly, maintained by collectors and aviation enthusiasts who recognize them as perhaps the finest piston engine fighter ever built. The sound of a Merlin engine at full power, that distinctive howl that German soldiers learned to fear, still echoes at air shows, a reminder of a time when the outcome of civilization itself hung in the balance. For the young American pilots who flew the Mustang in combat, the aircraft was more than just a machine. It was their partner, their protector, their ticket home. Many of them, in their later years, would speak of their Mustangs with a reverence usually reserved for people, not objects. They remembered specific aircraft, individual tail numbers, the quirks and characteristics that made each one unique. They remembered how the stick felt in their hands during a high-speed dive, the G-forces pressing them into their seats during a hard turn, the moment of controlled chaos when they opened fire and felt the aircraft shudder as 6 machine guns unleashed their fury. They remembered the fear, the adrenaline, the losses, but also the absolute confidence that came from flying the best fighter in the sky. That confidence was not misplaced. The kill ratios, the mission success rates, and ultimately the outcome of the war itself proved that the Mustang was exactly what its designers intended it to be: the perfect predator. The Germans had laughed when they first encountered reports of a new American long-range fighter. Their intelligence services dismissed it as propaganda, impossible claims from a desperate enemy. When they finally faced it in combat, the laughter died in their throats, replaced by the scream of Merlin engines and the chatter of 50 caliber machine guns. They learned too late that underestimating American engineering and industrial might was a fatal mistake. The P-51 Mustang didn't just shred their lines, it shredded their entire strategy for defending the Reich. It turned their airspace into a hunting ground where they were the prey. It escorted thousands of bombers deep into Germany, enabling the systematic destruction of the Nazi war machine. It broke the back of the Luftwaffe and cleared the skies for the invasion that would liberate Europe. In the end, the story of the P-51 Mustang is a story about consequences. The consequence of brilliant design meeting desperate need. The consequence of Allied cooperation producing something neither nation could have achieved alone. The consequence of industrial capacity deployed with strategic purpose. And most of all, the consequence of underestimating an opponent, of allowing confidence to blind you to emerging threats until it's too late to counter them. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war carried those lessons with them for the rest of their lives. They had faced the Mustang, and they had lost. Not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they were fighting against an aircraft and a system that was simply better. The thunder of those Merlin engines, the silver glint of Mustang wings in the sun, the traces that ended so many lives and so many dreams of German victory. Those images haunted them. The Americans had come to the skies over Europe in a fighter that the Germans initially dismissed, and that fighter had destroyed them utterly. The laughter had turned to silence, broken only by the sound of history being written in the contrails over a defeated Reich.